So the last piece of the puzzle here is actually implementing the Handey microservice. And as we'll see when we walk through this, we're going to talk about the various pieces for the HandeyApplication microservice, including the controller and the service, but most importantly, the repository classes, because that's really what matters here. And of course, that uses the R2DBC reactive database framework. And you can find the code in the EX3 project, in my WebFlux folder, in my Live Lessons GitHub repository, way down here into the QuoteServices subfolder. So here we are in the project. We're going to take a look at the Handey microservice. Let's open it up, look in the code, and you can see that we've got this QuoteServices package, which contains the microservice and the repository. So we'll take a really quick look through the microservice side. Nothing really too surprising here. This is just going to say I am an R2DBC microservice. Using that, it calls up to the base applications run method to launch everything. And it's also got this command line runner demo method, which we can uncomment if we want to see what's happening and what's in our database. This is mostly useful for debugging purposes. Here's the Handey controller. This is just what we looked at before. No real surprise. We auto-wire the application context in the Handey service. And then we have a bunch of endpoint handler methods just forward to the Handey service. As I said before, the Handey service could probably be removed, and we could just have the controller auto-wire directly to the repository. Just to be consistent, I kept it this way, but in real life, you probably would cut that out. All right, let's take a look at the more interesting part. So here is the Handey quote repository, which, as we see, is an interface that extends the reactive CRUD repository that comes out of the box, and also includes, through multiple inheritance of interfaces, the multi-query repository. And this is a Java Data API keyword-centric method that will find any quotes that contain this query as a portion of the quote, ignoring the case. That is generated for us. But the ones that are not generated for us are the ones that are here in multi-query repository. We talked about these before. This will look for matches that have everything in the list of queries, and this will have matches that match anything in the list of queries. So let's go take a look at the multi-query repository impl, because that's where it all comes together. So you'll see here that we have a multi-query repository impl, which implements the multi-query repository. This uses the repository implementation pattern that Spring knows about. This is one of those convention over configuration things again. And down here, we have the database client, which is going to be able to do these reactive queries. Notice that that's auto-wired for us automatically. And here's the find all by quote containing ignore case all in method that takes the list of queries, and it'll only return things that match everything. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a query string, which is a helper method I'll show you in a second, that will select anything from the quote table where each quote has to be like this quote. And then we're going to put all the other queries here in such a way where we'll use the AND keyword to AND them all together. So if you have 7 things we're going to be looking for, it'll be basically doing the comparison of one and the next and the next and the next and so on. And then we just pass the query string in. So let's go take a look at build query string. This is what it looks like. We're going to make a local variable called expand params that will filter the queries according to the where filter in a case-insensitive manner. So we basically make this little thing here, which is going to do joining on the where filter. And just to be clear, this is the where filter you can see up there. And then we're going to go through and replace the params placeholder, which you can see up here. That is going to be replaced with these expanded parameters that we did there. So that's going to make us a nice string that is, in fact, the SQL query. So we've got ourselves an SQL query that we build up using our helper method. And then we're going to call another helper method called getQuoteFlux. And this is where we have to be really, really clever. So you can see we take the SQL string query, and we use the database client to perform an SQL query on the database using the SQL string. So that will go ahead and do a query. And because this whole thing is reactive, then we're going to take the results of this. These are the things that match that query, which are going to come back as a bunch of objects, which is weird, but that's the way it works. And what we're going to do here is for each of the objects that matched, we're going to use the arrayUtils obj2number helper method to take the ID of each of the matching rows and tell it to treat what comes back as an integer. And so that's going to allow us to be able to extract these integers from this thing. That's the first parameter. So we're going to make that be the ID for the quote object we're creating. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look up the quote portion in that row object, which is an object, not a quote. And we're going to convert that into a string. So we're going to use our clever little obj2number thing to get this as an integer. And then we're going to use row get. It knows how to do strings. This is the part of R2DBC that's annoying. You would like to be able to use this get here and then put something like row.get ID and then put integer, but it didn't work that way. Maybe it works that way now. It didn't work that way when I did it a year ago. At any rate, this maps the rows, which are objects, into quote objects. And then we call the all method here, which doesn't block, but instead it will emit the various quote objects as they appear, as they are emitted from the database. They are emitted, and it'll stream them back to the client. So what's really cool about this is you don't have to wait for all the matches to be done from the query in order to start streaming the results back to the client. That's the win of using R2DBC and how it works in a reactive asynchronous way. Okay, so that was, we just looked at find all by quote containing ignore case all in. And then down here we have find all by quote containing ignore case any in, which is almost identical. The only difference is we use an or here, whereas before we used an and. So other than that, they're really pretty much the same structure. Once again, key takeaway from all this stuff is refactor your code to conform to the don't repeat yourself principle so that we can have as little code that is replicated as possible. I probably could have gone even further here, but I figured this was good enough. So really, these calls factor out the parts that are different. We have to pass in these two different strings. But we use build query string to extract out the parts that built the query string. And we wrote get quote flux, which factors out the stuff that does the query. And as a result, we can use or reuse almost exactly the same code for both these different methods, even though they behave in different ways. And you could imagine if you wanted to do yet further ways of doing queries, you could build something similar on top of this that would work in a similar way. So again, the virtue of refactoring is you get a lot of reuse, and you have only one place to modify and maintain your code, which is a win. OK, so that is basically how this part of the program works. And that should give you quite a bit of information necessary in order to do assignment 2C.